Okay, I should mention that according to the schedule, I have 30 minutes. So if you wonder why I'm not carded, that's why. I may still be carded, but I've got 30 minutes. And also, we're planning to have a discussion, a short discussion after this last presentation. So, and that can be about this combined session or about anything else. We're going to try and think towards the future and directions we should take. So keep that in mind, and we'll be looking for invitations from the audience to kick off discussions. So, okay, as Joanne said, what I'm giving you is sort of the greatest hits of the Aberdeen workshop. Now, I should say greatest hits in my estimation. There was a lot of good presentations made, so I'm giving a personal selection of things that I found very compelling, and selections that I think develop a theme that runs through the types of discussions that we had here. So I'd like to acknowledge the combined effort of my co-conveners, Joanne Morgan, Loretto O'Brien, Santiago Sorbino, and Iago Mosquera. So this was put together by the five of us, and we really enjoyed the resulting workshop that came from it. Okay, I'll start with a bit of a historical perspective. Certainly implementing biology in management in a more direct way has been a long-standing goal. So I'd like to just highlight the different working groups that have contributed towards these efforts, really beginning with the NAFO Working Group on Reproductive Potential, which was formed in the year 2000. One of the terms of reference was to look at ways and methods for implementing information into management. Basically, the same term of reference appeared for each of the subsequent working groups, including ICG GROMAT, the NAFO Working Group version 1, the NAFO Group version 2, the NAFO Group version 3, and then most recently, FRESH Working Group 3. Now, you might think it's a measure of our spectacular failure to make progress on this issue that we have the same terms of reference popping up time after time after time, and it's certainly arguable that we could have it once again as a term of reference for a future working group. So this might be perceived as a high degree of incompetence. But I would like to say that you have to sort of take a big picture look at what we have achieved by dint of these sustained efforts. And Peter Wright highlighted the fact that we've now got qualitative descriptors for good environmental status, including the population age and size distribution that's indicative of a healthy stock. And I would like to say that I think it's the fact that this qualitative descriptor is included is really an outcome of the sustained efforts of these working groups. So rather than considering ourselves failures, I think we should consider ourselves to be very successful. We all know how hard it is to change institutional thinking. So well done to everybody who's contributed over the years. Why should we include this in assessments? Well, the reasons are endless, and certainly they popped up again and again. I'm just summarizing a few here. Life history traits are a key determinant of stock resiliency. They can give different perceptions of productivity compared to spawning stock biomass. Biological reference points for the alternative indices, the more biologically realistic indices, can differ from spawning stock biomass, and we've seen some examples of that this morning. The alternative indices can reflect better the demographic features of the stock that cause variability in reproductive potential. And I think in many ways, the indices are better able to capture the cumulative impacts of changing ecosystems on stock status, because certainly reproduction is dependent on the environmental condition that the female experiences. I think what's fascinating is the conceptual linkages that exist between resiliency, maximum sustainable yield, with stock reproductive potential. And I think in some of the presentations by Paul and Liz, we've started to see the conceptual basis of why these underpin reference points, i.e. our assessment of stock status. And So consequently, some of the aims of Fresh Working Group 3 and the workshop specifically were to provide participants with expert advice into implementing information on stock reproductive potential, really geared towards implementation into their stock management application, and then to review and recommend best practices for incorporating information about growth, maturation, condition, and fecundity into management plans. Now, these are very ambitious goals. We had a 3-day workshop. Obviously, our ability to comprehensively address the terms of reference were limited, but I think it just stimulated some thinking, some discussions, and some future research, and we hope to have manuscripts that are the sort of products of these 2 aims. The format of the workshop was, firstly, in the morning we had presentations by invited experts. So we divided the workshop into 4 sessions. Session 1 was estimating stock reproductive potential. Session 2 was implementing estimates into assessments. Session 3 was, are we doing it better, worse, or just differently? Session 4 was coding it up. And we had a variety of distinguished invited experts. And so in the afternoons, stimulated by these presentations, we broke out into sort of individual groups, smaller groups. We'd identified topics that required further discussion, and then these groups reported back in plenary at the end of the day. So it was a nice combination of presentations and opportunities for discussion. And we had a wrap-up discussion sort of illustrating or discussing where we should go. So what I'm going to do with my talk today really is give selected highlights, in my opinion, from each of the presentations by the invited experts, and then I'm going to conclude with some of where do we go from here. Again, it's a personal spin on these things, but captures some of the flavor of the workshop. So Bridget Green gave a presentation, What Can Maternal Effects Tell Us About Stock-Recruit Relationships? This is obviously a very topical issue. And Bridget's published a paper. She's at the University of Tasmania, but she really came to attention with a review paper, a comprehensive review paper on maternal effects published in 2008. So she's expanded from her thinking from that review paper, if you're familiar with it, and she gave a very nice presentation. I picked out 3 sort of issues that she touched on in her presentation that I thought were particularly compelling. She highlighted that what we're seeing for these well-studied stocks is that there's a high degree of within-stock diversity in key life history traits and behaviors, and that it's this within-stock diversity that we need to protect through our management plans. She illustrated the need to understand how maternal size interacts with a lot of other things, including environmental conditions and behavior. So a running theme through her presentation was the interactivity of maternal effects. You just can't consider it as impacting only one process. It impacts simultaneously multiple processes. I think she also, in my opinion, made an interesting point. She said agriculture maintains breeding stocks so as to optimize offspring quality, while there's the potential for fisheries to selectively remove the best breeder. So you could make an argument that on a very fundamental level we're doing it wrong in fisheries. Adrian Reinsdorf presented a presentation titled Factors Affecting Reproductive Potential Application to North Sea Place. We've already seen from Mark's presentation reference to this study, which was published very recently in the ICES journal. And as Mark indicated, Adrian had a particularly elegant formulation of total egg production. I regard this formulation as the new standard of the best possible formulation, the most highly resolved formulation of total egg production that we have. And the reason why is it includes, it differentiates between recruit and repeat spawners. And also he has, because North Sea Place is one of these incredibly well-studied stocks with a long time series of biological data, he was able to resolve his life history traits according to not only age, but also age and size. So he took into account the age, size, composition of the stock as he estimated all the life history traits such as maturation, weights, and fecundity. So very elegant study. And he presented some of the long, beautiful time series for this stock. These are length at age for ages 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 North Sea place. You can see that the data go back to the mid-1940s. And what's nice about it is the combination of data sources that he's pulled together, or I should say his institute, I'm sure it wasn't him single-handedly, that include otolith back calculations, survey data, market sampling data. And what you see over these very long decadal timescales for North Sea place is that there are trends in length at age, and in particularly in the younger individuals in the population. So there's a high dynamic range in this data. These are a similar time series starting in 1950 for the maturity data for different age classes. And again, very nicely resolved level of biological detail from ages 2 to 7. And you can see in recent years in particular, there's a tendency towards increased proportions mature at a given age. So what we've got for this stock is very strong directional trends in key life history traits that impact stock reproductive potential. Mark showed this slide, again, very, very strong indication that this gives us, by incorporating biological realism, we get a different perception of stock status. The red line is the working group estimate of SSB scaled by a constant to convert it to units of total egg production. So that gives you one impression of stock status, and as you sequentially add the biological detail into the estimates of total egg production, you reduce your estimate of total egg production. So the stock status is not as high. So there's not only this sort of systematic shift towards lower estimates. In some years, and in particular around, for example, the year 2000, there's a complete difference in the short-term time trends. So in Adrian's paper, and of course Adrian's very distinguished fish biologist, high profile, he makes the statement that our results underscore the plea to increase the biological realism in routine stock assessments. So a very clear call to do better. And a follow-up presentation to that was made by Peter Wright, and he focused on the stock reproductive potential in the North Sea. Of course, he's developed a time series of total egg production for that. He highlighted the fact that the assessment uses constant maturity at age ogives, and the sort of ridiculousness of this position is shown in the panel on the lower panel. And what you can see is the time trends in proportions mature for ages 1, 2, 3, and 4. And if you can see the crossbars at the start of the time series and the end of the time series, those indicate the values that are used by the assessment. So you can see that the real empirical data are higher than the values used in the assessment, and that there's a directional time trend. So this isn't being captured in the assessment, this directional shift. Peter made the point that to a certain degree, this has been counterbalanced by a decline in the population relative fecundity. So this is again that term total egg production divided by spawning stock biomass. If you look at the red time trend, you see that overall there's been a decline in the productivity per unit gram of the spawning stock biomass, and this is really due to the increased dominance of age 2 fish in the spawning stock biomass, and that's shown by the blue line where you see, I might have that wrong. But anyway, there is a decrease in the population relative fecundity, and that is somewhat counterbalances the increase in the maturity ogive. So the insight, if I could capture one single insight from the first session, was that total egg production is able to capture the dynamics of directional changes in key life history traits, once again reiterating that if you build in the biological detail for these very well-sampled stocks, you're adding signal, not noise. Okay, now what I'm about to present from Paul Spencer's talk is stuff that he actually included in his presentation today. That's a little bit of a pitfall, but also a little bit of a bonus, because I get to re-emphasize the relevance of these points that he made in his keynote address today. He presented the relationship between weight and fecundity and emphasized the sort of extreme nature of getting an exponent equal to 2.5, which is a selected example, of course, but it can illustrate the exaggeration of the effect that bigger fish are disproportionately more fecund than small fish. And then you see on the right the sort of his modeled version of the impact, the maternal effect on larval survival that he explored in his sort of simulations. So this is again emphasizing that maternal effects are important in this case to viable larval production. He also showed this, and I find this an incredibly compelling figure. We have on the x-axis the B exponent from the fecundity weight relationship. So a fecundity, when this B exponent is equal to 1, small and big spawners have the same individual relative fecundity, and as that value increases, big spawners become disproportionately more fecund compared to small spawners, and that there's a direct dependency of the value of the reference points on this key aspect of reproductive potential. So the reference points we use in management are clearly tied to individual fecundity. We had a presentation by Kobe Needle following on from what Peter described for North Sea haddock, and Kobe is a lead stock assessment scientist responsible for many fisheries in the North Sea, but North Sea haddock in particular. And so Peter and Kobe were a great duo in presenting the biological side and then the management side of a situation where you have directional changes in life history traits that are not being accounted for in the management strategy for this stock. So the top panel shows the time trend back to the early 60s in spawning stock biomass. The black line is what the assessment calculates. So that's using fixed values over time for both natural mortality and maturation. So they played around a little bit and added in the biological detail of varying maturation rates and somewhat variable mortality rates. And if you do that, i.e. add in biological realism, you get very large, considerably higher estimates of spawning stock biomass, and by sort of related to that, you change your perception of fishing mortality such that fishing mortality rates are lower. So this is a very interesting situation. It has impacts if you calculated a reference point using the more realistic data. Your reference point, your BPA, would actually increase from a value of 140 kilotons calculated using fixed assumptions, and up to 260 kilotons. And when management, when this was discussed within the working group, the assessment working group, of course, they kind of choked on this because it has enormous implications for the management advice if you had a difference of this magnitude. So in Kobe's estimation, he reminded us that increasing maturity was not the whole story. The relative fecundity of the stock was changing. As I said, it was a counterbalance to the increase in maturity. So this was their get-out clause that they saw, well, maybe we don't have to change things because, while it's moving in this direction on this parameter, it's moving in the opposite direction on the other parameter, so we're going to do nothing. But the point is, you've got the math, why not do the math and see what the dynamics actually are? So he sort of was a little bit cagey. He said management should perhaps is kind of a double sort of weasel word, I guess, should perhaps be based on total egg production, not SSB. And then he indicated it was going to be discussed at the assessment working group the following month. Well, that working group has now taken place, and we have reports from Peter Wright, message received at this very symposium that in fact Peter's work is now incorporated. His working document on these topics are now going to form part of the main body of the text, and when I heard that a few nights ago, I was absolutely delighted. It was a zippity-doo-dah moment, and it was really a beachhead into an assessment. It's illustration that you can change things. So the insights: biological reference points are dependent on key reproductive potential parameters, including maturity and fecundity. So there is that message. I'm only restating what has already been stated several times already. Joanne convened session 3, and in conjunction largely with work she's done with Hilario, she gave a really fine overview of, are we doing it better, worse, or just differently? So she systematically went through the literature, just like Bridget did in her review paper, and these types of works are very key because there's lots of literature, and when you have somebody who goes over all of it and sort of tries to glean larger meta messages, then I think it's very useful. So she really wanted to assess how we were doing. And so the first goal, of course, would be better recruitment predictions by using alternative indices of stock reproductive potential. We've already this morning had a little bit of discussion whether or not this is a legitimate goal, but it's a goal that people often sort of expect to see there. And there's certainly been published studies examining whether or not, in fact, your predictions of recruitment are improved. So in Joanne's estimation, there were 5 studies here for a variety of stocks. And was there any evidence of improved recruitment predictions? Well, there were in 3, but not in 2. So it's a limited number of studies, very mixed evidence for whether or not you're improving your stock-recruit relationship. The next thing would be better recruitment predictions by considering age or size structure. So this is really kicked off by the plot I showed earlier from Gudrun Martinsdottir work on Icelandic cod, where she showed a positive relationship between age diversity indices and recruitment. So that stimulated a variety of studies that tested the same hypothesis for their stocks. Of the 4 studies that Joanne reviewed, this goal was achieved in 3 of the 4 studies, so slightly better, but still small sample size. Yeah, that's true. Although data quality on that study was a little bit, anyway. Okay, so another goal would be improved performance using alternative biological reference points, and there's a few studies here. Mark's already mentioned, I think, the 2006 study by Guy Oliveira. There was a follow-up study for horse mackerel published in 2010. The goal, again, sort of mixed evidence. It's not systematically finding improvement or unimprovement, but I find this actually rather gratifying as opposed to fisheries-induced evolution, where they find it everywhere they look. This, I think, is, I'm just joking. You're supposed to laugh. I'm going to get into trouble. Okay, so Joanne concluded, whether or not we do better is stock-dependent, a very fair assessment, very fair, balanced assessment. When there's not much trend in the biological parameters, you just might be adding noise by flipping to this alternative index of stock reproduction potential. We do have to be aware that data quality or a limited amount of data is going to compromise the signal, if you like, in the alternative index. But there are certainly lots of evidence of large amplitude changes in reproductive characteristics, the life history traits that contribute to reproduction. And so that's a strong argument in favor of switching over to the alternative indices. So the major insight, I guess, from this session are that alternative indices of reproductive potential can improve the stock relationship and advice when there's a signal in reproductive potential that's not being captured by spawning stock biomass. Okay, the 4th session we called coding it up, because obviously assessment is a very modeling intensive, computer intensive activity. We need comparable tools to take new information into the assessment arena and try and do the job of managing stocks. Liz pointed out in her presentation that, and this also connects through to Santi's presentation on how you approach estimating biological reference point. In Liz's presentation in Aberdeen, as was the case for her presentation this morning, she identified two basic approaches to defining biological reference points via the stock-recruit relationship or via a yield per recruit analysis in cases where you don't have stock-recruit data. The terms that are highlighted in red there are the terms that are expressions of reproductive potential of individuals. So there's no denying the fact that reproductive potential feeds into our estimation of biological reference points. And, okay, thanks. Did you say 10? Okay, so stock, this really, I'm going to do her a disservice by attempting to capture this, but this was the figure that she presented to define these conceptual quantities, and she highlighted in her presentation phi zero being the unexploited spawners per recruit. It's a very fundamental process, and it has, you can have a lot of fun with it, and that's what we learned in Aberdeen. And she linked, she began in a very elegant sort of parameterization with the Beverton and Holt, highlighting the slope at the origin. And I'm just repeating what she just said, so I'll go through this quickly. Then she indicated a link between alpha, the maximum lifetime reproductive rate, and you can calculate this by multiplying the slope at the origin of the stock-recruit relationship by this quantity capturing unexploited spawners per recruit. So that's how you calculate this parameter alpha that was introduced by a very well-known paper by Myers et al. 1999. The great thing about this is that it links through to the lifetime reproductive rate that Yvonne presented for northern Gulf of St. Lawrence cod. So all of a sudden we can draw in life tables. Life tables free you from the stock-recruit relationship. So if we can somehow have a sort of merging of our understanding of the parameters that are different expressions of reproduction and mortality and the balance between those processes. Then she defined steepness, which is a measure of resilience, which can be analytically derived once you have these alpha values. So my point here is that it's all a sticky ball of wax. All of these different expressions of productivity are fundamentally interrelated to each other and possibly telling you more or less the same thing. I'll skip over these and remind you that there's a functional dependency of your biological reference points on this fecundity exponent. So steepness, for example, depends on fecundity. Steepness determines reference points. Ergo, fecundity determines reference points. Our final presentation was by Santi, and he was highlighting the utility of FLR for implementing some of this type of information that we've been discussing directly into the modeling tools that are used in stock assessment. So I think this really underscoring that we have at our disposal the tools to talk to assessment scientists in their own language. The only thing that it requires is for the biologists to become very adept at programming in R. Okay, big challenge.
Not just our FLR.
FLR, okay. Thank you, Joanne, speaking as one who's made the jump herself. So reproduction underpins our definition of biological reference points, and we have the tools, the modeling tools via FLR and other types of computing tools to quantify uncertainty, just as we've seen in the presentations by Liz and Paul. So where do we go from here? We had a little bit of discussion about this, not enough discussion about this, and maybe in the follow-up discussion that we had this morning, we can start thinking about this too. So this is a little bit informed by the discussion at the workshop and a little bit, I guess, by my own personal reflections. I think some stock should bite the bullet and use this information in a very defined way. I have my own candidate stocks, but I find some of the stocks that are very data rich. It's just, it's unscientific not to push this to some sort of utility in assessment. So I think we are at this point. It's just a case of continuing the pressure. We're not going to go away, so let's use the information. If for some reason that's not acceptable, then I think that one option, and we discussed this at the workshop, was to include a reproductive status report. Many stocks do this for environmental status. They include qualitative information about what the conditions the fish are experiencing. I think we can do the same, and I think that's the beachhead that Peter has now established for North Sea haddock. So well done, Peter. Length is an important component of growth and reproduction, but it needs to be reported consistently. Most IC's assessment reports give very little evident information of length variation. It's all expressed as weight variation. Thanks. I'm just about done. Sensitivity analysis should be done to illustrate the components of which are having the greatest impact on stock reproductive potential. This was a key requirement of the assessment scientists at the workshop. They wanted to see demonstrations, quantitative in terms that they understand, in language they understand, of the impacts. And we need to show that switching over to total egg production doesn't deteriorate the advice. It might not improve the advice that much, but there should be no deterioration. And I think we've got the opportunity to explore conceptual and empirical linkages between, among all of these different metrics of stock resiliency. So thanks to all the workshop participants. So we had a great group of people, we had fun discussions, and I really enjoyed it, and I think my co-conveners really enjoyed it as well. And then thanks a lot for your attention. I'm sorry I picked the red card, but I'm the last stock, I could do what I want. Thanks.